barely obstructed.
Right. Okay, I'll play around with it.
All right, well, we can hear you and you can hear us, so that's the main part of this. Okay, it's 2 p.m., so let's get started.
Good evening, Mayor, members of the City Council. I'm Eric Sehal, your Director for Economic Development. Today, we have a team from our Development Services Department, as well as myself, to give you an update on the city's housing element efforts. And so if you give me a moment here, I'll share a screen. Okay. So some background on the housing element. It is a mandatory element of the city's general plan, and it's the only element that requires a regular update and oversight by the state. That is the Housing and Community Development Department, which oversees the housing element process. The housing element intent is to ensure that the city has planned for future housing development across all economic and social segments of the community. And the city currently has done a really great job at constructing and owning our own affordable housing units. And we're currently sitting above 1,100 total housing units the city owns. However, with the elimination of the redevelopment agencies, it's become more difficult for the city to build new affordable housing. And instead, we've had to rely on partnerships with different nonprofit developers and multifamily housing developers to obtain new affordable housing in the city. So this whole process I mentioned is administered by the Housing and Community Development Department at the state level. And what they do is they administer and initiate the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. Now, HCD looks at demographic and growth patterns and provides a formula of each region's and each council of government's obligation to provide more housing in the state. Once that calculation is completed, it comes to the Southern California Association of Governments, our council of government, for adoption and then dispersal of those units to each one of the communities under the SCAG region. So for SCAG, they started that process in 2018 and had preliminary numbers available in September. And their final RENA allocations were adopted in February 2021. What's made it somewhat difficult for all cities is with the final allocation coming out in February, there's a state law that the housing element had to be adopted within 120 days of October 2021. So we had roughly 8 months to get this thing, the housing element reviewed, public engagement, and ultimately submitted to HCD for review. For the city of Palm Desert, our RENA allocation had moved quite a bit. Our obligation that was ultimately adopted is roughly 2,700 units. And you can see that on the table on the right, how that had increased from the previous housing element of the fifth cycle, where we went from 413 units to over 2,700 units that needed to be planned for within the city of Palm Desert. Of those 2,790 units, 1,500, almost 1,600 of them are dedicated for affordable housing. We wanted to show quickly the efforts between the fifth and sixth cycle housing elements. I mentioned that they're adopted on an 8-year basis. So the last time that we adopted a housing element was in 2014. That's the map that's shown there on the left in color versus what was recently adopted in 2022, which is shown on the right-hand side. And in staff's looking at the next round of housing elements, we did not identify any new parcels in this next round for the sixth cycle. We looked at what was approved in 2014 and maintained it in this existing cycle for the sixth cycle. So we want to also touch base on some of the milestones that the city hit. I mentioned the SCAG numbers didn't come out until February. We were already engaged in our process to update the housing element. We hosted public meetings and workshops in early January. We also made a first draft of that housing element available for the public in February. And on 4 separate occasions, we submitted drafts to Housing and Community Development for their input and feedback, starting in April, again in September, and later in December. Our draft housing element ultimately went to City Council, was adopted on March 10th. And once we submitted that draft housing element to HCD, we actually just received a letter in June saying that they had 2 items of concern for the housing element. One, they want some additional language on affirmatively furthering fair housing in the community, and we're working with our consultant now on how best to address that. But also in looking at it, the site A in the northwest portion of the city, they determined was inadequate, and that they would actually want us to remove that site from the housing element. So with site A gone, we went back to HCD and tried to understand how they prioritize these sites for affordable housing. First, HCD, in looking at where cities should be placing affordable housing, they want us first to look at vacant land. So in looking at vacant land in the city, a lot of it's north of Frank Sinatra. And again, we kept the same land that was there in 2014. HCD also looks to make sure that the land is zoned appropriately, that it's zoned for residential uses, that it has higher density, and for our city, it's at 22 units per acre, and that it doesn't require a change of zone. So for site A, HCD commented that the zoning for site A is actually a commercial designation, unlikely to go to residential, or in their eyes, unlikely to go to residential. So now they've asked us to remove it. And they've also asked us to prioritize, or the state prioritizes projects that are no greater than 10 acres in size. So what we've been learning this whole time is that how the changes in allocation have really affected Palm Desert. We showed what was approved in 2014 versus what was approved recently. And we better understand now how HCD prioritizes properties for our RENA obligation. Not only that, we looked at how the state funds affordable housing, what makes applicants more competitive to get state funding. And so we have a better understanding how CIDLAC, the state agency, actually funds affordable housing development throughout the state. And one comment that we started hearing was a lot about equity. We didn't identify any new sites from the 2014 housing element. And the unintended consequence of that is that those existing sites now have a burden of greater percentage of affordable housing on those parcels. So after this slide, I think Rosie and her planning team, in looking at the evolution of this, has some recommendations on how we can start to look at that and make this program more equitable.
Can I ask a quick question? What does the WNG stand for after Spanish Walk?
That's the property owner or applicant for the property,
Okay.
for the project.
Thank you.
And then, we've been somewhat fortunate. I mean, Palm Desert's done a really good job in partnering with affordable housing developers. And two that we're currently working on now are the Vitalia project and Spanish Walk. And what we learned going back to how the state funds these projects is that both of these are extremely competitive. The reason being is they provide lower levels of affordable housing ranges. The density is appropriate, the land acreage is appropriate, and the number of units they're proposing has made them very competitive for the state. So with that, I think I'll be turning it over to Rosie and Richard to talk about the rest of the staff's presentation.
Thank you, Eric. And this really dovetails what we're presenting next with our lessons learned. So I want to take you to today's status of entitled projects, which is projects that we've taken through the process, as well as those projects that are in the pipeline. We have a total of 2790 units that are allocated to RENA. So far today, we have 2,413 units that are provided in each one of these categories. As you can see, we have a need still of 188, and that is 47 in very low and extremely low, and 141 in the low. And I'll walk you through each one of those projects.
Rosie, could I ask a quick question for clarification? You referred to projects in the pipeline.
Yes.
That 2413, are there real projects in the pipeline, or does that simply summarize the what we have identified as appropriate for development?
And I will walk you through that. If we can go to the next slide. So these are the entitled projects. And these are the ones that have received approvals either through Planning Commission, City Council. As you can see, there's Vitalia, Spanish Walk, Millennium Apartments, and the Sands. Those have received their approvals. The ones in the pipeline is Palm Communities, and UHC, which is Site D, and it's north of the school site. Those two are currently in application, heading to Planning Commission and our City Council in July and August. So with the entitled projects and those that are in the process of receiving their approvals, we have a net need of 188 units. Does that answer your question, Councilmember Kelly?
Kind of. RENA just requires us to identify appropriate sites, correct?
Correct.
It doesn't require us to actually have a development entitled, although that's a terrific thing. And
Correct.
of course, we aspire to that. And it would be great if this could be distributed so we can really study it. But is the 188 actually the need that remains after we take account of things that are truly in the pipeline? Because if that's true, it's a big deal. And it puts us ahead of most jurisdictions.
And that's exactly why this slide is here, is to really show that we're in a really good position. We started in 2021 entitling, and today in 2022, from that 2,790 number, we're in good shape. We only need 188, and that's in very low, extremely low, I'm sorry, and low. So we're heading down the right direction. And that can take us to our next slide, which is what sites we're recommending so that we could seal the deal with our housing element. So with the sites that we now know that HCD has priority criteria on, vacant land that does not require rezoning or changing, that has a density of 22 acres, and that a project that's no greater than 10 acres, these are the recommended sites. The site F is a site that was already in the housing element. The other two sites are housing authority projects that have that were in the previous housing element, so we left that here. And then we've added on the university specific plan. This is our SARTA property. We call it the 170, and we've added units here as a new site. And this is, the location of this property is on the northeast corner of Portola and Frank Sinatra. So we believe that adding this site would give us a proper cushion that we need to meet the 188, but also take a contingency in case any of these other projects do not actually come through.
Do you want us to ask questions as you have the slides up, Rosie?
Oh, sure. Yes.
Okay, so on this one, you used the word equity earlier, and I'm looking at a 16.3 acre site where we're asking for 150 units. And then down at the bottom, 170 acre site, 10 times as large, and we're asking for 220.
Correct.
That's just math-wise, that's not proportionate. That's not equitable. How can you clarify
Sure.
that?
So HCD wants to see sites of 10 acres. So even though we've got a site that's 170 acres, and Eric, if you could take us back to that map. So that is the entirety of site 5. It also includes site 6 and site 4. That is the entire 170 acres. Site 6 is already under construction, and site 4 is under construction. So really we're looking at site 5, but the entire project is 170 acres, and it's under a specific plan for us to propose. And this is, again, our SARTA property, which our SARTA property first has to go to an affordable housing developer first before we can actually sell it off to a private developer. So since this SARTA property is within our control, HCD will accept 10 acres. They will not accept more than 10 acre parcels, to be included in this, in the RENA number.
Councilman, if I could jump in on that to help clarify Savvy's question. On that side F that you see, which is the one you just asked about, there's two things that are going on there. There's the straight line proportionality question that you're bringing up. It doesn't quite work that way with this, because you've got two factors. You've got HCD, what they want to see, but then you've got this other complicating factor being SIDLAC and what they will actually fund. And so we've been working with them. They typically want to see a site that's 10 acres. We have seen them fund tax credits on sites as small as 8 acres, 7 to 8 acres. So we've been working with this property owner as an example to basically carve off a 6 or 7 acre site, amend that housing element requirement to meet both HCD's requirements, but also make sure that we think that give it a fair shot of SIDLAC providing tax credits to it. So you have to weigh both of those when you're talking equity and proportionality. And that's going to be the way that we have to assess these other sites. It's one thing putting them in the plan, but if they can't get tax credits for them, then it's just an administrative exercise and we're keeping people from developing their property. So that's what we're having to balance.
Okay, that's good. And then just to finish up on that one slide, Rosie, if you can bring us back to it. And by the way, I raised that question because I imagine that property F may raise that same question. Of course, we need to be prepared with a rational and
Sure.
supportable answer. But my last question on this slide is total recommended is 434. If we're only short 188,
Mhm.
can we support asking more than the RENA requirement?
Well, that's where, our lesson learned is that we need a cushion. For any of these projects that we currently have in the pipeline, we're going to 2029, so anything can happen from here to there. So we want to make sure we're covered in case, there's any market conditions or any other projects that may come through. If those expire and, we have to entertain another project. So we definitely want to have that cushion.
Doesn't that cut both ways? Because we've seen projects just voluntarily, I guess there's profit in it, come in as an affordable housing project. So
Yes,
that's can swing either direction, right?
that is correct. And that'll help us to, if a property in lot F cannot meet their allocation, then we could reduce whatever extra we have, and it's called a net zero, but we could reduce those parcels that we have here in their allocations. So that is our cushion.
Okay, thank you.
We've got other questions.
Rosie, question back to the 170 acres.
Yes.
If we ultimately end up putting a regional park in that area, or at least identify it, does that help us get more credits? Does putting a park there have additional benefits with tax credits, affordable housing?
We learned that it does from our Palms Community Project, that they're, being next to a regional park does give them some points. I do not know much about the funding sources of it, but if we have maybe Eric or Jessica.
Rosie, I can help with that.
Mhm.
Yes, Councilmember Nastandi, yes, it would provide a higher point for any project that is within the vicinity of that part of a park point. And also, depending on how they score originally, it would also help them in their tiebreakers.
Thank you.
We've got one more question. Or two.
Yeah, quickly, I just want to make sure I'm looking at this correctly, that what staff is proposing just affects 10 of the 170 acres. Is that correct?
That is correct. And that is, again, what Eric was mentioning as the sweet spot for HCD. HCD does not want to see large parcels. They want to see small parcels. And we've been able to identify 10 acres within our property that we could recommend to HCD to approve.
Alrighty, my question is in regards to the neighborhood reactions and engagements that were the result of Vitalia. And I was wondering if with these communities, one of the, I think one of the resolutions was allocating a certain amount of the units for veterans. Is that something that we can, continue to move forward as a positive when the communities in those areas are going to inevitably fight that they don't understand why it has to be in their community? Are we building in any of those compromises that benefited or worked at Vitalia?
We certainly can. What's important for us to meet our RENA obligation is that we dedicate these units based on certain income categories.
Would they also qualify for additional federal funding or support?
I'll defer to Jessica.
Yes, if it was, there's actually a large NOFA that HCD has with regards to assisting special needs, and that includes veterans.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I think those are all the questions. We can get to the next slide. All right, so here are our recommendations, which we've discussed, is to allocate the 220 units of the University Neighborhood Specific Plan, or Site 5. Again, this is within our, it's a SARTA property. It reduces the allocation from Site F, and that's the one that's circled in yellow. And it also accommodates the elimination of Site A, which was mentioned earlier on HCD, rejecting that site. However, I am going to give you a caveat. We have not submitted to HCD, but if there is a chance that HCD does not approve our Site 5, we may need to explore alternatives. And the only other site that may meet the criteria of HCD, and it doesn't meet it today, but it may meet it, is our Site 8. And that is about 80 acres. We would not be able to allocate all 80 because, again, would not be accepted by HCD, but 10 acres of that property would be able to be allocated. Now, that is within our assessment of the site and not something that HCD has already reviewed and or approved. So, this is our staff recommendation today. It meets the RENA obligation. We believe that with our proposal, HCD will certify our housing element. It is, in the efforts of being more equitable for the remaining vacant parcels, and it builds a cushion. So this is what we are proposing, and hopefully, if there's any feedback for us, if moving forward with this recommendation, we could discuss that right now.
Kathleen, please.
First, I really appreciate staff's work on this. It strikes me as thorough and informed. And of course, HCD's reaction can't be fully predicted, but I appreciate the efforts to be as fully informed as possible and to think through all the considerations from their perspective as well as the city's perspective. So thank you. I'm curious, have any developers of any type expressed interest in Site 8?
Yes, we have had developers come forward with, just nothing, no application or no pre-application, just discussion. we had a discussion with senior housing, residential lots, single family lots, multifamily lots, but nothing concrete in the last maybe 6 months to a year.
Okay, Mayor Pro Tem, please.
Oh, thank you. So just a couple of kind of big picture questions. Number one, if we put forth a plan that identifies specific properties that then meets our RENA requirement, how does that impact the city's ability for future, I think the term we used in the past is exactions. And we struggled with the hammer, the carrot. My point is, I mean, even if we demonstrate an ability and an expectation that we meet RENA, can we in some way encourage and facilitate more affordable housing development?
Yes, short answer is yes, you can. And that's actually, I think, our next slide.
Oh, I thought you were ready for the big picture questions. Then I'll.
I think what's next is this is staff's recommendation, but we have other items for the council to consider and discuss.
Okay.
And Councilmember Quintanilla has her hand up. I'm sorry, Mayor Pro Tem, were you finished?
I was just going to say I'll hold that question and my other kind of big picture question till the end. Then thank you. Sorry.
Absolutely.
My question is about multi-use. Is staff presenting that idea as people come in for different businesses, and would there be a need to rezone somewhere so that we can pick up little bits and pieces? Is that something under consideration?
So I think we can speak on that on the next slide. And this slide here will help us with that discussion. So when we further the housing, affordable housing discussion, so we are looking at possibly a policy. What we're recommending is that we utilize the Affordable Housing Subcommittee to discuss maybe the following, I think some that will incorporate some of the items that you mentioned. Adopt an affordable housing policy that's consistent with HCD. What we want is for our projects to be successful. So not only for us to identify affordability, but also for them to be able to get the funding they need to be able to be built. And so that was one of the lessons learned is we need to understand funding sources so that we know what is that sweet spot. We know it's 150 units. We know it's 10 acres. We've seen some projects receive funding when it's less than 10 acres, and trying to understand that situation a little bit better so that we are more successful with our affordable housing projects and not just implementing affordable housing allocations. Require a minimum number of units to be set aside for affordability for all new developments, or pay an in lieu fee. We could also explore those ideas and make an assessment of, what are our vacant lots, vacant parcels, what can we repurpose? Do we want affordability at the mall? Do we want affordability in downtown? How do we want to distribute in the future? And thinking ahead, develop a program to incentivize developers, not just maybe funds, but also, just some discretionary items. And any requests to increase or decrease density, change of zones, general plan amendments to include an affordability housing fee, and or we determine number of affordable housing units to be part of projects. So these were ideas that we tossed around that we'd like to discuss with a subcommittee and possibly come up with some policy moving forward. And I think we could open that for discussion.
What do we have? I do want to say, I so appreciate the lesson learned part of this, and having plan B, so we're prepared and we can get through this process in the best interest of the community. So that, I think that's a terrific approach you took. Mayor Pro Tem Jonathan, please.
Thanks, Jan. Rosie, are you looking for feedback on this slide on these points?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so I can tell you that just speaking for myself, I very much favor the carrot approach rather than the hammer approach, meaning when we make an across the board requirement based on size or whatever, in my experience, it's not always good policy. And it can deter developers when we want to encourage them to develop within our city in the proper manner. So I tend to favor either an incentive program or a quid pro quo where, hey, if you want to change in density or change of zone or whatever, here's what we need from you. So speaking for myself, anything that doesn't include a blanket requirement or, you know, certain kinds of requirements that might scare off developers, I would favor that carrot approach over the hammer approach.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments or questions?
I think one thing to Savvy's point that we may want to consider is asking for the subcommittee to consider kicking around with us the idea of a minimum like 10% of the site being or something like that, depending on the size, to help meet those goals. Part of what I'm concerned about is taking the arbitrariness of those negotiations out. Staff is continuing to find themselves in a situation where absent some policy and council direction, it's just kind of a never-ending fight where we're having to get our city attorney involved in play poker with developers. It's much easier to say, here are our basic standards. If you want to do something differently, we're willing to listen and talk to you about it. But at least starting out with everyone on the same page and giving them the ability yet to be a little bit more creative. I mean, the fact of the matter is I think the way that we had to initially set up these first few compliance reports with HCD really put the city staff in a tough position, because there were certain developments out there that had that burden on them, and to deal with 100% affordable housing, and others that were exempted out of it. And the question really becomes why and how and where's the policy, and then let's get into the state law. So it may be that we set as low of a bar as we can, and then provide the development community the ability to get a little bit more creative with this. But having mediated some of these discussions recently and watched us scrambling around for answers and watched HCD sort of move their philosophy on us, we probably need something a little bit harder. I don't think the hammer needs to be real hard right now, given the progress we've made, but we need at least a solid starting point for everyone on these sites that we're developing. There could be some folks that come in and say, look, we're willing to do X, Y, and Z that we hadn't even thought about. But I think providing staff at least that policy direction on these affordable housing sites to start the conversation moving is important, because absent that, we are really trying to reach a goal here with nothing behind us. The housing element's there, but HCD has moved the rules on us at least twice in the last year alone. So that's kind of the practicality of what we've been dealing with and why we're here. I just want to throw that on the table, that I think there may be a need to take both approaches and find that middle ground.
Well, and I get that, Todd. I would defer to staff's expertise and the subcommittee's deliberations. I'm just pointing out that there's two sides to that coin. Here's an example. Let's say we get a really creative developer, as we have in the past, like for that 170 acres, and they want to create a variety of housing, and not affordable housing necessarily, but housing that is affordable. That could be for rent homes, as we're starting to see even here in the Valley, for families that cannot afford a home, but therefore now have the opportunity to live in a home by renting it. It could be multi-unit apartments. It could be very small lot type homes. And, that's a different paradigm to make that work out financially, right?
Yeah.
And I wouldn't want to scare off a creative developer that can deliver something that I think our community needs, because they look at and they say, whoa, as a starting point, they want 10% affordable housing or whatever, and therefore we can't do this. So they just jump to the next city for their consideration. So I'm not opposed to it. I'm just saying we need to consider, I think, both sides of that coin.
Yeah, and I think we've moved past that discussion right now. We've been able to fill up that moderate income bucket, and what we've learned over the last year or so is there's very few people that can work in that low to low, extremely low area. They're experts in tax credit, they're experts in financing, those types of things. It's a real niche market. So I would agree with that comment if we were looking at more multifamily with moderate income sprinkled in. I think you're absolutely right. When we have to show progress in filling those extremely low and low buckets, it changes the conversation because the universe of people that can pull that off is very small. So I think that's kind of what we're needing to kick around with the committee is we have actually started getting direction from HCD that you've got more than enough moderate income housing. You need to focus on these other buckets. And that's really changing the way we think about this and the advice that we need from you.
Any other discussion, questions?
Oh, can I ask my big picture question? Okay, so it looks like, you've got a map and you've identified where low income housing is going to go, affordable housing is going to go. What happens when reality happens? And, all of a sudden there is that private developer and he creates more than we need under RENA. I mean, these are kind of projected things that are going to go on. What happens when reality sets in? Do we move the chess pieces around? All of a sudden that parcel F doesn't need to have affordable housing? What happens when things change in the future?
I think that's exactly why we wanted to bring this policy to you, is because that's what we're seeing happen. We're seeing different methodologies being articulated out of HCD, and by at least coming up with some type of a formula that until we meet those goals, we expect everyone to help us meet the share in meeting that obligation to the community. Once, I think the question is, once you hit those and meet those obligations, then what? You reconsider the policy, and that is exactly the point that we need to talk about the feedback from council. We're a lot closer than we thought we were in getting there, and you are right. Some of these, particularly Spanish Walk, we had no idea that was even coming at us, and all of a sudden it started changing the numbers. But again, a very niche developer with a very niche market that knows how to maneuver those tax credits. So it could be in 5 or 10 years, we're back here saying, you know what, we need to completely rethink the policy. We're in good shape, or they've changed. The numbers have changed even more. But at least we've established how we're going to continue moving forward, and we have the same answer for everybody. And that's what's important. But until we get to that point where HCD says you've met your obligations, it's all talk, because we just don't know what's coming at us yet. This was very unusual for a community of our size this year to get funded 2 projects, and so maybe it bodes well in the future. But part of that, I think, also is that we've got a council willing to set aside these areas that are practical for developers to come into, and that helps these developers when the community is so well behind them.
Okay, so final follow-up on that, and then I'm done. We I think heard from Jan, was it the state auditor that indicated that the state's RENA numbers may be twice as high as they should be. If something like that happens and all of a sudden our requirement gets cut in half, does all this discussion go away? Can we not justify having any exactments from any developer because we're already way in excess of our requirement?
If that were to happen, we'll be back to you there too. I mean, we are sharing the rules and information and updates with you as we get them. The last information we got from HCD is that we still needed to continue refining our plan and finding different sites. So we're trying to be as good of players and partners as we can. But in that situation, we'll be back to you saying, well, we've got a different recommendation for you. But I think the big picture with this conversation, most communities aren't having this type of a discussion. They're wringing their hands saying, why do we have to do this? Where Palm Desert's actually going out making it happen. So we're in good shape right now.
Is there anything else? And I will mention that, and Kathleen could certainly attest to this, the last RENA cycle was extremely difficult, extremely contentious. And it was not an easy moment. And we'll see where we go with this. But it was a very difficult RENA cycle. Is there any other discussion? I do want to point out this is a study session. I do see a hand up, but this is not a place where we bring in public comment. So I thank you for participating, but this is not the place for that. Are there any other comments or questions?
Are we in good shape with council to have the housing subcommittee work with staff to try to continue refining this? Is that something that you're agreeable to? Okay.
I can speak for myself, yes.
Okay.
Agree.
Great. Well, it's impressive work, and I look forward to doing some more work on it. And thank you so much for this was a lot. And I can see there was a lot that went into it. So thank you very much for all the work. Yes,
And
please.
could staff please send your slide deck to us?
We will be doing that right after this meeting.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and do I see Councilmember Nastandi's hand up?
Oh, no, I didn't mean to.
That's okay.
I thought you were signing off. I was waving, see you soon.
You were ready to go, weren't you? Okay, is there anyone else that has any thoughts or questions?
Great job, staff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really great job, and I'm so proud of Palm Desert's position on housing and what we've always done, so this is great. Okay, thank you. And we'll see you at 3. Everybody has time for a little break. See you then.